year and a half to the next presidential election, what legislative announcements are you expecting, and how can institutional asset allocators prepare for the impact of those over the coming year?
Well, in a divided Washington, the way we have now, there is a very little expectation that much will be done on the legislative front. And I think the best to hope for is, first of all, that we want to avoid trouble. So that means in the context of a potential debt ceiling increase, that we don't want to see a default on the federal debt. And we don't want to see more government shutdowns. So hopefully we will see clear from any trouble, if you will, on the legislative front. I don't think that there will be a lot of accomplishments that the administration will be able to point to, given the partisan divide, not just in Washington, but the reflection of that divide across the country. But I do think from an investor standpoint, the areas, there are really three areas to watch. First is the regulatory arena. And this administration, not unlike others that have faced a divided Congress, they are turning to their regulatory powers because it's so difficult to see any legislative progress in changing the law. And so we have seen a hyper regulatory state under the Biden administration. You look to regulatory bodies such as the SEC, the FTC, DOJ, and the rest. They are very ambitious with their programs. We just saw the SEC come out with new rules as far as stock buybacks, and they're open for comments now. We've seen increasing requirement for disclosures in the area of human capital as well as the climate. All of these bear on the cost to regulants. And so when you're an investor looking to see the trend, I think we can just assume under this administration there'll be increasing costs that will be incurred by potential companies that would be investment targets. Additionally, I think from the M&A front, and I'm on Wall Street now at Moelis Company, we are very focused on what's happening at the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. Because as we've seen now, a very new and unconventional approach when it comes to the antitrust law. And I think the courts are increasingly going to assert their authority and jurisdiction when it comes to maybe moves that these regulatory bodies are making outside of really where the statute lies. I would say next to look at things off into the future that maybe some are not looking at, and that's the tax environment. There is going to be a significant fall off, if you will, or a shift in the tax environment come 2025, and that's only a year and a half or so away. And what that means is the enactment of the so-called Trump tax cuts are going to be facing expiration in 2025. So there is, in federal budget terms, about a $2.7 trillion fiscal cliff, if you will, that will impact all taxpayers. Rates are going to go up. Exemptions are going to be taken away. We're already beginning to see on the business front the ability to write off CapEx expenses and needing to amortize them rather than expense them is already underway. So as an investor, one would look to see this as a less beneficial environment for a particular company they may be looking at, and heightened scrutiny on what their investment decisions, allocation of capital decisions are going to be in a new environment come 18 months from now.
What do you see as the major geopolitical risks that the US faces, and how do you foresee these playing out in financial markets through the remainder of 2023 and into 2024?
I don't think there's any question. The most serious geopolitical risk that we face out there as a country, both at the federal government level as well as private sector actors and investors in the US, it is the geopolitics around China. And I think even when you look at the Ukraine Russia situation, the thematic of China and its hegemonic aspirations is just beneath the surface as well. And increasingly, what you're seeing play out is a domestic political agenda here in the U.S. that doesn't give the administration a lot of room in terms to engage in diplomacy. And so increasingly, I think we're going to see a much more strident anti-China agenda. I think the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, recently gave a speech in which he laid out a much more robust policy vis-a-vis Beijing, very focused on making sure that the national security of the United States is paramount. And this will play out from an investing standpoint in that if there are any industries that bear on national security concerns by America, that increasingly, I think we're going to see a decoupling between the U.S. and China. So I do think that's something to watch out for. In addition to that, I think sort of an offshoot of that is what we're seeing now in this onshoring or friendshoring trend. This obviously comes in a post-pandemic world where people all of a sudden woke up to see the over-reliance that we have on China for some strategic supply lines. And increasingly, the policies that are being undertaken in Washington, in fact, in other allied countries, is to make sure we're not overly reliant on powers and countries that aren't necessarily looking out for our best interests, and that has to be China as number one. So again, from an investor standpoint, I just think increasing premium, if you will, of risk that is attached to anything having to do with U.S.-China relationship.
It's a fascinating area that's obviously going to develop over the coming years/decades. In your capacity of vice chairman with Moelis Company, you advise clients on the intersection of public policy and industry. Where do you see the opportunities in industry, both based on the current administration's priorities, but being prepared for a potential switch should Republicans prevail in the November 2024 election? Where will we see public policy stability regardless of these election winners?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the most immediate public policy impact in terms of the investment environment has to be this tremendous amount of cash and liquidity injected into the economy by the legislative agenda of the Biden administration. And remember, this was a unilateral legislative agenda in last Congress. This was primarily the IRA bill, which provided for tremendous subsidies in the area of electric vehicles, and trying to push our country towards energy transition. We also saw the CHIPS Act, which was another bill with tremendous amount of subsidy that goes towards the semiconductor industry and to enhance the incentives for manufacturing in this country in that particular sector. And then thirdly, you had the passage of the infrastructure bill, which did have some bipartisan support, but again, is a halfway coming out of Washington, providing a subsidy to industry. So I do think in the short term, what we're seeing is a lot of clients and industry players look towards those subsidies to try and promote private sector investment as well. Listen, I think if there is a change in administration, we can expect a wholesale 180-degree turnaround in terms of the regulatory posture. There's no question. We have seen that since the Bush administration, into the Obama administration, into the Trump administration, into the Biden administration, that every time there's a change of party in the White House, pretty much things are 180 degrees turned around on the regulatory front. I do think, though, what is interesting to watch is whether a Republican-controlled Congress, if allied with a Republican-controlled White House, will begin to undo some of the subsidies and policies legislatively that have been undertaken and enacted under a Biden presidency. And so we'll have to see how the election plays out. But that could have pretty extreme impact given all of the trillions of dollars that will be flowing into the economy. The Republican Congress just demonstrated in the passage of the latest debt ceiling bill that it is willing to undo a lot of the incentives towards energy transition and the rest. So we'll have to see where all that falls out.
In the latest report from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, US insurers had approximately $8 trillion in cash and investable assets. With such immense financial firepower, is the time right for more legislative action to loosen capital restrictions on insurers, set against how to ensure stability of the sector in the face of any unforeseen economic cliff edges?
Well, I think as your membership certainly knows best, insurance regulation takes place at the state level, and anytime we try and introduce federal meddling into, I think, a regime that has proven the test of time, there should be a lot of warning flags. There is no question a lot of uncertainty in the capital markets today, given the monetary policy that's being pursued by Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve, uncertainty regarding the regulatory structure in terms of regional banks and banks as a whole. So I do think that state regulators are probably watching all of this with a mindful eye towards putting a priority on stability.